Phyrexia, a plane split between 5 predators. A plane that has been the centerpiece of several different stories in Magic the Gathering's history. A plane that currently shares its name with 462 creatures types. Despite all these cards and all the different sets that Phyrexia is involved in, what does it have to show for mechanically? The story and lore of Phyrexia and the Phyrexians has been combed over many times, but story is only one half of the game. The mechanics, what the cards actually do, is the other half. And Phyrexian cards have had a bit of an identity crisis mechanically, never seeming to be able to mesh together properly into a dedicated Phyrexian typal deck. So today, let's look at this plane through a mechanical lens and focus on the unfocused design of Phyrexia. This video topic was suggested by one of the fans in the comments section of a previous video, so if you have an idea for a video or just want to keep up to date, be sure to comment below and subscribe so that you do get a notification when a new video comes out. Now, while I did say I wouldn't really focus on Phyrexia's story, the story defines mechanics and imparts some of the mechanical issues. New Phyrexia is split among 9 different spheres, with 5 of them being the domains of the mono-colored predators. Because of this, a lot of Phyrexian cards are split alongside color identity. White Phyrexians gain life, create tokens, buff their creatures, and have keywords like Vigilance and First Strike. Blue Phyrexians draw cards, trigger when non-creature spells are cast, and mainly stick with flying as their keyword of choice. Black Phyrexians sacrifice creatures, utilize -1/-1 counters and life loss, reanimation, and have a plethora of different keywords like Menace, Death Touch, Flying, Intimidate, Trample, and Haste. This makes sense, as a majority of old and eroded Phyrexians resided in the black piece of the color pie. Red Phyrexians sacrifice artifacts and creatures, use fire-breathing style combat buffs, damage opponents and creatures with burn effects, and have fast, cheap threats with keywords such as Trample, Haste, and First Strike. Finally, green Phyrexians buff themselves and other creatures, hate on non-creature permanents like artifacts and enchantments, and enlist big creatures with keywords like Trample and Reach, and different protective ones like Ward and Hexproof. If this all sounds suspiciously similar to me just explaining Magic's color pie, you're absolutely correct. The Phyrexians that reside within the 5 different spheres just kind of adhere to their color identity. They don't really do anything unique, they just do what their color does. This leans less in the direction of a typal strategy and more in the direction of just picking the good cards for that color. Sure, the red and green Phyrexians could work decently together, but you're just building Gruul aggro with a weird deck building restriction that keeps you from running better options. And for this example, there really aren't any Phyrexian specific payoffs in these colors. Now, to be fair, there are a couple of Phyrexian lord effects. Some are conditional, lording creatures with infect, toxic, or oil counters. Grafted Butcher, a true 2-mana lord for Phyrexians, looks like a good start. But the unique mechanics of Phyrexian cards are yet another point of dilution and lack of focus for the deck. The mechanics of a creature type are incredibly important for synergistic viability. There needs to be a good enough reason to play a bunch of Phyrexians and work with the deck building restriction of playing a bunch of Phyrexians. So what do we have to work with? Phyrexian mana symbols give the player the choice to either pay that colored mana normally or cheapen the spell at the cost of 2 life. This is one of Phyrexia's most powerful mechanics. Turns out, making spells cheaper or free at the cost of life is good, and this mechanic led to the bannings of Mental Misstep, Gitaxian Probe, and Birthing Pod. But again, like with the 5 spheres, we're running into the same problem. This isn't really a Phyrexian mechanic, it's a mechanic that creates good cards for other decks. The cards that are properly balanced around Phyrexian mana are decent in a plethora of decks. The ones that are poorly balanced around Phyrexian mana are either broken to be banned or unplayable and hardly worth running to make a Phyrexian deck. Infect changes how creatures deal damage, so they deal damage to other creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and to players in the form of poison counters. This is another strong mechanic that supported a viable archetype, and led to the banning of Blazing Shoal. But yet again, we have a mechanic that doesn't really incentivize a Phyrexian deck. Glistener Elf, Blighted Agent, and sometimes Eagerclaw Mirror and Phyrexian Crusader are the only infect creatures that see consistent play because they are either incredibly cheap or play around current meta. The rest of the deck is mostly combat tricks to buff up the infect damage to take out an opponent as quickly as possible. While this is getting closer to a Phyrexian deck, it's really just a blitz deck using a Phyrexian mechanic to keep itself viable. Proliferate puts an additional counter on a permanent or player that's a copy of a counter they already have. While this mechanic used to be Phyrexian unique, after the printing of War of the Spark, other spells and cards now have access to it. The biggest issue with Proliferate in a Phyrexian deck is it is a supporting mechanic for the wrong thing. If trying to win with Infect, combat tricks are much more mana efficient than Proliferate effects. And if you're trying to buff up your Incubator tokens, well, let's talk about those. Incubating creates an Incubator artifact token with X +1/+1 counters on it, which can be transformed for 2 mana into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. This mechanic really suffers from the 1 set per mechanic problem. Because of this, it's mostly designed as a limited archetype, and there really aren't enough cards with Incubator to help a full deck. Because of this, it's not even really a Phyrexian mechanic, it's just its own mechanic. Cards that support it do not support Phyrexians as a whole. The cards just happen to be Phyrexians because incubation is a thing they do during the invasion. I'd argue that the mechanic has 2 decent cards, Chromehost Seed Shark and Sunfall. Chromehost Seed Shark doesn't care at all about Phyrexians and is more at home in a Spellslinger or Artifact deck and hardly in 60-card formats. Sunfall is an unconditional exile board wipe that gives you a body on top of this. Again, it has nothing to do with Phyrexians and wouldn't even really help in a Phyrexian deck. Foil counters are a type of counter that give additional effects based on what they're on. Some get buffed, some can activate their effects, some cheapen or are cheapened by them, and some lose you the game when all their oil counters are gone. Like Incubate before it, oil counters are mainly designed for a limited environment, albeit this time for Phyrexia all will be one, and again suffers from the very first problem we talked about. Oil counter cards mostly have no synergy with each other or other Phyrexian cards, instead just copying what they do in their color pie. While some cards actually do care about the synergy, like a Lord for oil counters, a big creature cheapened by permanents with oil counters, and cards that can place oil counters on things, the mechanic is held back by its balanced nature. The oil counter cards that see some play are, again, good cards that happen to use oil counters and does not give enough of a payoff to restrict yourself. Corrupted gives additional effects to cards if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters on them. Hey, do you think maybe only using a mechanic for 1 set at a time is causing design issues? Because yet again, we have a mechanic that is mainly only designed for a limited environment. The majority of the time, a strategy utilizing poison counters doesn't need middling effects that trigger when you're a third of the way to winning the game. The most played card with Corrupted outside of Commander is Anoint with Affliction, a card not played for its Corrupted effect. Complete is Phyrexian mana on Planeswalkers. You can cheapen them at the cost of them coming in with 2 fewer loyalty. I don't really feel like I need to explain why a mechanic restricted to Planeswalkers isn't great for a Phyrexian deck. This is another mechanic created for story beat reasons, and I only really included it because it is technically Phyrexian. Toxic gives players X poison counters if a creature with Toxic deals combat damage to them. Note that this is different than Infect in two ways. One, it doesn't give -1/-1 counters instead of damage when it connects with creatures. This isn't really that big of a change, as that's not really what Infect was trying to do anyways. The second change is more important. You can't increase the amount of poison counters given in a vacuum. This is pretty clearly a change to make a standard friendly Infect mechanic be balanced, and to top it off, there are only 2 cards that were printed with Toxic 3 or higher. In Standard, Bant Toxic utilized Skrelv's Hive, Skrelv Defector Might, and Venerated Rot Priest alongside other Toxic creatures and combat tricks to play a tempo-oriented game plan that even ran a bounce spell that proliferated. I also lied before, as Skrelv's Hive and Bring the End's corrupted abilities were the other instances of corrupted cards seeing play, and this time, the abilities were useful. Skrelv's Hive's lifelink effect gave the deck some protection against other aggressive decks, and Bring the End became a straight up counterspell. Honestly, Bant Toxic is probably the first true Phyrexian deck we've seen. It's a deck that utilized 3 of the Phyrexian mechanics: Toxic, Proliferate, and Corrupted, and was piloted to decent success. So at least in Standard, it seems like we did get a true Phyrexian deck. Unfortunately, that success never really translated outside of Standard, and as of current time, the archetype is slowly fading out of the Standard meta. A true Phyrexian deck has only manifested once for 6 months in Standard. New mechanics for Phyrexians have always felt like Wizards giving an apology letter for the mechanical mistakes of the past. Infect and Phyrexian mana were just too strong, so when they tried to bring them back, they reined them in. Hilariously, this led to the mid-rangification of one of the most aggressive strategies ever created. The changes with Toxic took away a poison counter deck's ability to smash in fast with combat tricks, instead forcing them to go wider and push through over time. Phyrexian mana came back as completed, which still allowed you to cheapen planeswalkers, but they didn't come in with as much loyalty as a cost. Then actual Phyrexian mana came back, but it was for weaker abilities or cheapening an already pretty expensive transform cost. Every mechanical reintroduction and change screams, "We're sorry, we want to do this again, we know we messed up before, we'll rein it in so it doesn't cause problems again." And because of this, Phyrexian mechanics get much, much weaker, and suddenly they're unable to prop up an entire typal strategy. This compounds with the current design strategy of sets. Gone are the days of sticking to one plane for multiple sets in a block, giving mechanics for the plane the ability to grow and gain more traction over time. We are now in an era of set pieces, and you can't stay trendy if you stick to one thing for too long. Now, one set per plane or story beat is the norm, and new mechanics are left to flounder and die before they get a chance to flesh themselves out and really shine. The best cards with new mechanics tend to be found in Commander Precons, where every bad mechanic can find a home in the most popular format. Elves ramp quickly and overrun the board. Goblins use cheap creatures as sack fodder for their bigger creatures. Merfolk attempts to out-tempo and bring in flash threats, as well as trying to disrupt and get under the opponent. What do Phyrexians do? Well, what the color pie tells them to do, usually. In Standard, we saw the honestly first example of a true Phyrexian deck. 3 different mechanics coming together to form an effective strategy. But unfortunately, even that deck is fading out of the meta and hasn't been replicated in other formats. On top of this, the splitting through multiple different mechanics, old and new, and a lack of proper typal payoffs have made Phyrexians struggle to get their own true typal deck. all never truly became one.